Remember this? 2007 and The Great Global Warming Swindle was released. It was written and directed by Martin Durkin and caused quite a stir when it was found to be riddled with errors, doctored graphs and deceptive editing. I showed this in a previous video. Two of the scientists who were interviewed even complained about how their interviews and studies had been deceptively altered. Diametrically the opposite of what I intended, said Professor Carl Wunsch. Fabricated and misleading, said another interviewee, Professor Egil Friis Christensen. 17 years on, and Durkin is back with a new film. And despite the deceptions of the past, millions of people unquestioningly believe whatever it says, just because it's
mainstream, full of professors.
Yes, I assert that there is no connection.
But science isn't decided by faith or the proclamations of professors, especially those who work in unrelated fields. It's led by the evidence. So let's be skeptical and check Durkin's statements and graphs against his sources. We'll see what he's made up, changed or omitted, and where the video contradicts itself. First, if you haven't seen Durkin's 2007 film, here's what it was about, according to Durkin himself.
This is a story of how a theory about climate turned into a political ideology.
And the 2024 film.
This is the story of how an eccentric environmental scare grew into a powerful global industry.
Okay, sounds pretty much the same. And so are a lot of the claims.
There are a large number of scientists who are in violent disagreement.
But despite this supposed large number of scientists, we see the same familiar faces in both of Durkin's films, most of whose work is in completely unrelated fields. So what have any of these people discovered in the intervening 17 years that changes or challenges scientific conclusions? Let's start with a segment called The Science.
We are told that current temperatures are unprecedented.
But not one scientific study says current temperatures are unprecedented. In fact, they all conclude the complete opposite. I showed in my video The Story of the Earth in 33 minutes, how the Earth's climate has varied from extreme hothouse conditions to deep freezes that covered much of the planet in ice. I didn't make this up, this is simply Geology 101.
It's possible to check if this is true.
Yes, just read any geology textbook. Of course it's not true. That's why Durkin doesn't cite a single scientific study that claims current temperatures are unprecedented, except Professor Strawman. Having invented this fictitious scientific claim, Durkin then gets his interviewees to explain what every geology undergraduate learns in sophomore year to make it appear as though the program has discovered something the experts didn't know. These strawmen make up a large part of the film.
You know, when I hear people pontificating about 1.5 degrees leading to the end of civilization, I think...
And they're saying it's too hot.
Okay, I don't know who's saying it's too hot, or who told William Happer that 1.5 degrees of warming would lead to the end of civilization. We're already over 1 degree and civilization's still here. All I know is that these claims aren't in the scientific literature and have nothing to do with science. So you can certainly include them in a segment titled The Stupidest Thing Tinfoil Hat Nutjobs May or May Not Have Said to Me, but you can't pretend that these are scientific conclusions.
Journalists were writing about the coming ice age. It was on the cover of Time magazine.
1970s, the new ice age was the big story.
I'm sure it was a big story, but a magazine story, and newspaper stories. I've criticized exactly the same media misrepresentations of science in my videos. If we look at the actual science, which is published in respected scientific journals, they showed the relationship between CO2 and global temperature nearly a century before Newsweek made up a story about a coming ice age. And scientists predicted that the world would warm decades before someone told Patrick Moore it was too hot. So let's get past the hype and the straw men and get to Durkin's 3 lines of argument against the science. First, it isn't warming much because the temperature readings are all wrong. Second, it is warming, but because we're in a cold period, that's good for us. Third, it is warming, but CO2 isn't the cause. And fourth, it is warming, but something else must be causing it.
Where there are more people and there is more human activity, there's more heat. This is known as the urban heat island effect.
It would be quite remarkable if climatologists hadn't known about this or considered it when analysing temperature data. And as you can probably guess, they do know about the heat island effect. In fact, they were the ones who discovered it and have meticulously measured and quantified it in numerous scientific papers. They discovered that in most developed countries, the heat island effect certainly impacts the temperature difference between urban and rural areas, but not the temperature trend. And it's the trend that's being measured. That's why we call it global warming and not global warm. The trend would only be affected if something was artificially raising the temperature around the weather station. For example, if an office block with large windows is built nearby, or a patch of grass was replaced with a parking lot. If and when that happens, then of course researchers recalibrate their equipment to compensate. To do this, they always use nearby rural temperatures as the benchmark. But studies have shown that in developed cities like Paris, it doesn't happen much anyway, primarily because weather stations tend to be located in parks and urban green spaces, which are less prone to changes. Where it does happen more often is in growing cities like Shanghai, where new developments rapidly overtake weather stations in rural areas. So the equipment is recalibrated and relocated to compensate for it.
According to rural temperature records, temperatures rose from the 1880s but peaked in the 1940s. Then there was a marked cooling until the 1970s. After that, temperatures recover, but are still today barely higher than they were in the 1940s.
But that's very easy to check. One of the problems with Durkin's hand-drawn cartoon graphs is that in his 2007 film, several of them used fake data and were manipulated to airbrush out warming. So we need to look at actual studies that have separated rural from urban data, and they show clearly that rural temperatures are not back to the temperatures of the 1940s, or even close. So even if you only use rural temperature data, the trend is still very clearly upwards at the same rate. Durkin's other piece of evidence that the Earth isn't warming much is satellite data.
You know, before they started releasing this, ground-based temperature records were going wild. They were going up, you know, like crazy with no bounds. But now they have to contend with the fact that there's this independent and probably better way of measuring the whole globe's temperature.
Yes, before satellites, the ground temperature trend was going up like crazy, according to William Happer. Then, in 1979, satellite data came along and they showed temperatures continue to go up like crazy, matching the ground temperature data. And since satellites aren't affected by urban development, that puts paid to the idea that the warming we've seen is simply faulty measurements caused by the heat island effect. I imagine that's why Durkin doesn't show us the satellite data. He just lets William Happer give the impression that they somehow stopped the temperature trend going up. As for being a better method of measuring global temperature, they clearly aren't, because satellites can only measure radiation. The temperature has to be inferred from that using complex analysis that's gone wrong time and time again. Both UAH and RSS analyses have been updated every few years as they failed to properly account for the satellite orbit slowing down. I won't go into details here because I've covered this in my video about Roy Spencer, so take a look. The second theme is that the Earth is warming, but because we're in a cold period, warming will be good for us, which is the same argument Durkin used in his 2007 film.
Before the Little Ice Age, we find a balmy golden era, when temperatures were higher than they are today.
That's the phony graph Durkin showed in his 2007 film, and as we'll see, he doctors a similar graph for the 2024 film.
The Roman warm period, the cold dark age, the medieval warm period, and then the very cold Little Ice Age.
The sketch shown in 2007 was based on a reconstruction by Hubert Lamb, published in 1965. It only represents data from central England, not the world, and the graph isn't comparing temperatures to now. Despite Durkin adding the word now in caps, Lamb's reconstruction only went up to 1950, before the recent period of warming began. 17 years on, and Durkin doctors another graph to again make it appear as though the medieval warm period was warmer than today. This time his source is a paper by Ljunqvist. But if we look at Ljunqvist's original reconstruction, you can see how Durkin's airbrushed out the period of warming at the end. That's the dotted line, which shows temperatures from 1950 to 1999. Now you see it, now you don't. If we put post-1950 data back into Durkin's drawing, we can see that the average global temperature 25 years ago was much higher than the medieval warm period, and if we add in the 0.45 degrees of warming we've had since 1999, it's higher still.
Compared to the last half billion years, the Earth right now is exceptionally cold. In fact, there are very few times when it's been this cold.
But Durkin's picture of snowball fights and snow rides are misleading. Parts of the Earth do look like this, but other parts look like this and this. Most of us don't live in these exceptionally cold areas or the exceptionally hot areas. We live in the temperate zones, as does most of our industry and economic activity. We're lucky that the Earth is now in a kind of Goldilocks zone, not as hot as the hothouses of the past and not as cold as the deep freezers.
And several thousand years ago, we see the rise of the first great civilizations, in a blissful period which, according to many studies, was considerably warmer than today. This is known as the Holocene climate optimum.
But again, Durkin doesn't show any of these supposed studies, and there's a good reason for that. Studies that have been done show that current temperatures are higher than the blissful temperatures of the Holocene maximum, and much higher than the temperatures of the rest of the Holocene when civilization flourished. And of course, temperatures are still climbing. This reconstruction shows temperatures up to 2006. It's already higher than the Holocene optimum, and if we add in the 0.3 degrees of warming in the 18 years since then, it's higher still. So surely, if all those were blissful temperatures at which human civilization began and flourished, then our aim should be to stay as close to those temperatures as possible. It's not just that we're rapidly moving away from the blissful temperatures, as Durkin calls them, we're doing it at an unprecedented rate.
There's no doubt that warm is better than cold in geological history.
It is? Well, let's take a look. During the hottest period, the Cambrian, there was no life on land. The reasons are explained in my video, The Story of the Earth in 33 Minutes. But is that better? By contrast, during the previous coolest period, the Carboniferous, the Earth was covered in forests and life proliferated. So is that worse?
CO2 is plant food, and the result of much higher levels of atmospheric CO2 in the past was a much, much greener world.
But based on what? Here's a reconstruction of CO2 concentration that Durkin himself uses. As you can see, the highest levels of CO2 were during the Cambrian, when it wasn't green at all, and during the lowest levels of CO2 concentration, the Carboniferous, there were extensive forests covering the Earth, from which we derive most of our coal. Ironically, the wonderful greenness being shown in Durkin's film comes from the present day, a period when the world is supposed to be anything but green, according to the claims that we're starved of CO2.
Periods of elevated CO2 tend to be time periods of a huge biodiversity on the planet.
But again, science has to be based on facts, not proclamations. Studies show that biodiversity has increased over time as carbon dioxide levels fell, which is what you'd expect of evolution. Having laid out the arguments that the Earth isn't warming much, and if it is, then it's good for us, the film then argues that carbon dioxide isn't responsible anyway.
So what evidence is there that this trace gas is having any noticeable impact on the climate?
That's an excellent question. Unfortunately, Durkin never answers it. He doesn't show any of the evidence which has been built up over the last 120 years. He doesn't get a climatologist on to explain it. He doesn't mention any of the thousands of scientific studies that have been done. Most importantly, he doesn't challenge or refute or disprove any of the research, which is odd because if it's so flawed, then that should be easy. Instead, he repeats arguments and claims made in his 2007 film, starting with an appeal to incredulity.
CO2 forms only a very small part of the Earth's atmosphere.
CO2 makes up a tiny fraction of the gases in the atmosphere, just 0.04%.
But researchers aren't interested in our feelings about how big or small something is. They're interested in measuring its effects. That 0.04% represents over 32 billion tons of carbon dioxide, up from 21 billion tons before the Industrial Revolution. So it's the radiative forcing from that extra 11 billion tons that they're interested in, and how much warming that causes in the atmosphere. It's ironic that in one part of the film Durkin argues that this 32 billion tons has a huge effect because it's responsible for all the life on Earth, and a few minutes later he argues that it's too small to have any effect. The other argument, as I've shown, is just a proclamation. Have someone who's never studied climate science simply proclaim that there's no connection between CO2 and climate change.
Yes, I assert that there is no connection whatsoever between CO2 and climate change.
And that's all very well, but no evidence is presented to support that assertion. Scientific conclusions can't simply be proclaimed, they always have to be supported by evidence. The only attempt to disprove the role of CO2 in this film is a very old fallacy that there's no correlation between CO2 and global temperature.
If it were true that higher levels of CO2 caused higher temperatures, we should be able to see that in Earth's climate history.
And we do. The Earth's discernible climate history goes back about 500 million years, and during that time there's a very good correlation between CO2 and global temperature. It's the reason researchers call carbon dioxide the control knob of global temperature and the primary driver of global temperature. Even during glacial cycles, where Durkin is quick to point out that initial warming is caused by changes in the Earth's orbit and tilt, it's carbon dioxide that causes most of the warming and leads us in and out of these glaciations. The evidence that CO2 is the primary driver throughout our long climatic history is so overwhelming that the only way Durkin can counter it is not to look at any of these studies or try to challenge them or disprove them, but simply have a couple of bloggers proclaim that there's no connection.
The question of whether CO2 drives the climate is easily resolved. You can look back in time over hundreds of millions of years. CO2 levels have changed radically many times. Did this cause temperature change?
The answer is yes. But Durkin isn't going to cut here to the evidence for that. Instead, Tom Nelson, who isn't a paleoclimatologist, he's an electrical engineer, and he's the producer of Durkin's film, is simply going to proclaim,
no, absolutely not. CO2 has never driven temperature changes in the past.
But that proclamation is disproved by many studies over the last 50 years, clearly showing that it has. Researchers don't just sit in armchairs and proclaim that CO2 is the primary driver of Phanerozoic temperature based on a whim or a gut feeling or their belief. They get out and discover it through a wealth of geological evidence. That's the big difference between professional researchers and amateur bloggers.
Ice ages start when carbon dioxide is at its maximum, and ice ages end when carbon dioxide is at its minimum.
But the reality, seen clearly in the geological record, is the exact opposite. There have been 3 very clear major ice ages over the last 500 million years, and each one, including the one we're in, was preceded by a drop in CO2 concentration, and the other 2 ended when CO2 concentration started to rise. The sudden plunge in temperatures during the late Ordovician, a short ice age, followed a sudden drop in CO2 concentration caused by intense chemical weathering due to a continental collision. The Carboniferous Ice Age was preceded by a drop in CO2 concentration as trees evolved and sucked carbon out of the air. Huge forests sequestered this carbon when they died. And our current ice age was preceded by a long decline in CO2 because of huge mountain building events in Europe and South Asia, again weathering CO2 out of the atmosphere. Tony Heller can say he doesn't want to believe it, or he could try to find a flaw in the evidence, but he can't simply proclaim the complete opposite of what the evidence shows and expect us to simply swallow it because he's on TV. Of course, he could be mixing up ice ages and glacial cycles, but since he's being promoted here as some kind of expert, surely he'd know the difference. So we never do get an answer to the question,
so what evidence is there that this trace gas is having any noticeable impact on the climate?
We never get to see the evidence. Instead, Durkin skips straight to a preconceived conclusion.
But if CO2 doesn't drive climate change, what does?
CO2 is quite unimportant in controlling the Earth's climate. What is important is clouds. Clouds don't absorb any energy at all. They simply reflect all of the sunlight back out into space. Big, bright, white clouds.
It certainly feels that way to someone like John Clauser, who got his Nobel Prize for experiments in quantum entanglements that have nothing to do with clouds. You can't blame him for thinking that, because that's what I would have thought too. After all, if you're on a hot day and the sun goes behind a cloud, everything around you gets cooler. So it stands to reason that clouds must only reflect sunlight, which means more clouds will cool the Earth and therefore fewer clouds will warm the Earth. But the point of science is not to make assumptions based on how you feel, it's to do experiments and take measurements to see if nature really does work the way we believe. Scientists who actually study clouds, and who of course weren't interviewed for the film, would have told Clauser that as well as reflecting sunlight, shortwave radiation, back into space, clouds also reflect longwave radiation back down to Earth. That's heat. They act as a kind of blanket, trapping heat that would otherwise escape into space. That's why a cold night feels warmer when clouds form overhead. A huge amount of research has gone into measuring these two different effects, and generally speaking, clouds at night, at higher altitudes and higher latitudes, have a net warming effect, while clouds during the day in the tropics and at lower altitudes have a cooling effect. The overall global effect of clouds on global temperature has been measured as pretty close to zero.
Professor Shaviv noticed that the amount of cloud cover on Earth is related to our journey round the Milky Way.
No, he didn't notice that, because no one has any idea what cloud cover has been doing throughout geological time, including Shaviv. There's no way of knowing. He simply has a hypothesis that there may have been a change in cloud cover because, like his colleague Henrik Svensmark, Shaviv thinks cloud cover may be seeded by cosmic rays. But I'm not even going to look at that rather tenuous link because, as Shaviv showed in his study, it has nothing to do with recent global warming. He says these changes take place over periods of 200 million years, which is 1 million times longer than the time period we're looking at. Again, Durkin doesn't mention that. Durkin then claims that research by Shaviv's colleague, Henrik Svensmark, shows that regular cycles of cosmic rays change cloud cover on Earth in concert with solar activity, such as the Sun's 11-year solar cycle, and that causes warming and cooling. But there's no match between the 11-year solar cycle and cloud cover or average global temperature, let alone a match for the spike in warming over the last 50 years. That's why it's a very old idea that's long been disproved. I hate to bring this back to the elephant in the room, but the rise in carbon dioxide, shown here in red, does explain the rise in temperature, shown in blue, and closely matches predictions. Which brings us on to Durkin's next claim.
According to computer climate models, over the past half-century, rising CO2 should have led to this increase in temperature.
Well, no, it shouldn't, if this model is based on different rates of CO2 increase to the one that we've had, which of course is what Durkin has drawn. Let me explain, because this one's very easy. The amount of warming depends on the amount of CO2 released through burning fossil fuels. Whether you accept that basic principle or not, that's what the models factor in. And the amount of fossil fuel we burn depends on unpredictable factors like economic growth rates, international agreements, and technological advances. So researchers always plot different temperature projections for different CO2 scenarios. I'll try to explain it more simply. No, there's no way to explain it more simply. They calculate different temperature projections based on different rises in CO2 concentration. It really is that simple and that obvious. Durkin doesn't say what rate of CO2 growth his drawing is based on. To give you an idea of why this matters, let's take this projection of future temperature rise forecast by Hansen et al. In 1988. As you can see, the researchers predicted that temperatures would peak around 2006 and then start falling. So that prediction clearly failed and completely underestimated global warming. Or so it seems. The reason for the discrepancy is that the authors actually laid out 3 possible scenarios, and this projection was based on CO2 concentration falling in a scenario where there was an international agreement drastically reducing carbon emissions. What actually happened was closer to the middle scenario, which envisaged a linear growth in CO2 concentration hitting 389 parts per million by 2010. That's close to what we actually got, 392 parts per million. Having exaggerated the predictions, Durkin then downplays the actual warming.
But according to multiple satellite and balloon measurements, what actually happened was this.
But balloon measurements are taking temperatures as high as the stratosphere, which of course is cooling as less heat escapes from the troposphere. By the way, this was predicted as far back as 1967 as a consequence of global warming, and it's since been measured. These models aren't predicting temperatures in the stratosphere for the obvious reason that we don't live there. They're projecting temperatures in the lower troposphere, which is where we do live. So if we only look at balloons measuring temperatures here, they match the roughly 0.18 degrees centigrade per decade of warming recorded by satellite measurements and ground stations. In other words, Durkin artificially pushes up the predictions and pushes down the actual warming, which is why they apparently don't match. If we look again at the actual predictions made in 1988 for a rise in CO2 we actually got, it's a pretty good match with the rise in temperature recorded by satellites and ground data. And that prediction was nearly 40 years ago. If we compare other projections, they're an even better match because our understanding of Earth's sensitivity is continually improving. But one of the best projections was made in 1982. The predicted CO2 rise and temperature rise are shown in black. Overlain is the actual CO2 rise in blue and the actual temperature rise in red. It was stunningly accurate, but it was never shown publicly. It was kept secret while the oil company that made it, Exxon, continued to fund campaigns denying any link between CO2 and global temperature and casting doubt on the science it had secretly confirmed. All of these models, including that of Exxon, are a lot better than the projections of the only climate scientist Durkin interviewed. This was Richard Lindzen's projection, which failed completely, and Roy Spencer even claimed in the 1990s that the world was in a cooling trend. But, of course, neither of these was shown as a failed model in the film. They weren't even mentioned.
Until the 1980s, global warming was little more than an eccentric scare story put about by radical environmentalists.
But of course that's not the case. The link between CO2 and global temperature was first published 120 years ago by Svante Arrhenius. It was confirmed by Guy Stewart Callender in the 1930s and 40s, and by the 1950s it was well accepted and given a name, the theory of climatic change, or climate change for short. By the 1960s and 70s, studies were predicting that we'd soon start to see the effects of these rising levels of CO2. All this was long before the general public or even environmental groups became aware of the issue, and decades before Al Gore released his movie. I don't have time to cover every omission or misrepresentation in the film. That would take far too long. But it's mostly repeating myths from blogs, tweets and videos, including interviews with the bloggers who propagate them. I and others have already debunked these myths over the last 15 years, but if you have a particular favourite that I haven't covered in this video, something you believe and which was included in Durkin's film, please do post it. I always read messages, so I'll be happy to explain what Durkin missed and point you to a video where I bust that particular myth.
The so-called consensus on climate has itself become a weapon, a form of bullying, intimidation and censorship used against those who refuse to conform.
Speaking out in scientific ways that go contrary to the consensus, I would say is a career killer.
If you belong to a professional association or you are in a university, you can be fired for saying what you believe.
You know, and you're going to get cut off, you're going to lose funding, you're going to get your career ruined.
I might take this alarmist nonsense more seriously if Durkin could cite a single example of someone who was fired or had his career ended because he spoke out against climate science. But he can't.
Dr. Matthew Wielicki was an assistant professor of geology at the University of Alabama when he decided to speak out about the climate scare. As a result of the backlash, he has decided to leave teaching.
To speak up about climate change in any sort of skeptical way was essentially career suicide, absolutely. There was no possible way that I would publish in quite a few of the mainstream journals that I was required to publish in.
But this guy, Matthew Wailicki, was not in the field of climate science. He was a mineralogist, and he wasn't forced out for his views on climate change. He left voluntarily, and the reasons he gave at the time were to spend more time with his family and the rise of illiberalism at the university in the name of DEI, diversity, equity and inclusion. He only mentioned climate much further down, and the context was he was annoyed that his colleagues were afraid to speak out, but he said nothing about him being afraid to speak out or leaving because of a backlash. Not only was Durkin unable to find a single example of someone suffering in their careers or being forced out or fired because of their views on climate science, the interviewees themselves were perfect examples of this not happening. Roy Spencer is still a researcher at the University of Alabama at Huntsville, a position he's held for over 30 years. Richard Linson kept his position as a professor at MIT until retiring. Nir Shaviv has continued his research at the Hebrew University of Jerusalem. Likewise, Henrik Svensmark is still a researcher at the Danish National Space Institute. Willie Soon, Sally Baliunas, William Happer. Not one interviewee from the 2024 film lost his or her job or had their career wrecked. They're either still working or they're retired. Same with all the other interviewees from Durkin's 2007 film. John Christie remains at his position at UAH, just like Roy Spencer. Same with the late Tim Ball, a retired geography professor at the University of Winnipeg. Patrick Michaels was a private consultant for the fossil fuel industry and continued in that role until he died. I'll have a lot more to say about this in a separate video where I'll examine some of these claims of career-wrecking censorship, and we'll look at where the real money is to be made in climate science. Most of the rest of Durkin's film is just opinion about politics and economics. So for that, let's go to the opinion room.
Grew into a powerful global industry.
It's a wonderful business opportunity, okay?
Well, yes, of course. Whenever a new discovery is made, business opportunities follow, going right back to the days when sewage filled our rivers. What a great business opportunity that was for companies building sewers. Ironically, when geologists discovered the ancient seas where oil was laid down and learned how it accumulates in certain rock formations, that was a
wonderful business opportunity
for the oil industry. So now that we know that rising carbon dioxide levels are heating the planet and we're looking for cheap, reliable, clean sources of power and more energy-efficient machinery, it's a
wonderful business opportunity
for those with brains and initiative rather than staying stuck in the past. Durkin doesn't explain how that disproves the science, because of course it doesn't. But it does explain some of the motivation behind the film, because the people most likely to be hurt by renewable energy are the same people who confirmed and then hid the link between CO2 and global temperature back in 1982. Normally I shy away from ascribing motivation, but we're in the opinion room, so here's my opinion, take it or leave it. I always form my opinion based on the facts, and with Durkin and most of his interviewees, the facts are pretty straightforward. The film's produced by Tom Nelson, a director of an organization called the CO2 Coalition. It's a lobby group whose sole aim is to promote carbon dioxide. It says so. The CO2 Coalition was formed in 2015 as an offshoot of the Marshall Institute, another lobby group that was partly funded by Exxon. The coalition prefers to keep its funding secret, but a leaked 2017 tax return from one donor showed that it received $170,000 the previous year from the Mercer family, which also donated to pro-fossil fuel lobby groups like the Heartland Institute and the Cato Institute. As well as Tom Nelson, the producer of the film, 4 of the interviewees are also directors of the CO2 Coalition: John Clauser, William Happer, Patrick Moore and Tony Heller. Then there's Benny Peiser, or is it Pisa, of the Global Warming Policy Foundation, another political organisation that also received money from oil companies. And Stephen Davis of the Institute of Economic Affairs, which has ties to Martin Durkin and received funding from BP and Exxon. So it's not surprising they can afford to make a very professional-looking film with location shooting in Africa and then distribute it for free. It's ironic that Durkin accuses scientists who acknowledge the link between CO2 and global warming of being political. In fact, anything he accuses them of, without evidence, from misrepresenting facts to faking data, is something he did himself, with very clear evidence. Now, there's nothing wrong with a film that's honest and accurate in its reporting, then it doesn't matter where it gets its funding from. But when a program deliberately fakes graphs, misrepresents science, and pushes a political message, it's fair to ask what the motivation is. And when you follow the money, as Deep Throat used to say, it becomes pretty obvious. Unless you left your brain on the bus into work. Much of the rest of the film is just interviewees complaining about how they're being silenced.
When you can't talk about the facts.
And censored and can't speak out, ironically while speaking out in a film that's had millions of views and speaking out numerous times on TV, at conferences, in magazines, blogs and newspapers. We have to end this somewhere, so let's end with the funniest example of projection, this one from Roy Spencer. He's the climate scientist who said the Earth was cooling at a time when every other climate researcher except Richard Lindzen was predicting warming. And when he finally accepted the error, he made another prediction that the warming would soon stop, because he's a fundamentalist who believes God controls the climate. So he feels there must be some kind of negative feedback. And even though every prediction Spencer has made turned out to be wrong, he still makes regular appearances on TV and at conferences, and now here he is again in a film saying this.
It doesn't matter if your alarmist prediction doesn't come true, you're still going to retain your status as an expert, and the media is still going to come and ask you for your opinion, even though you were crazy wrong about your predictions.